I used to work for Pop Gordy, Barry's father, and physically labor, I have built Motown with my hands. Well, all the headlines said I was fired, you know, but I don't see how you could fire someone out of a group of that magnitude. But there were some differences business-wise, and at that time, things just could not be smoothed out. And there will come a day that I will tell the whole story.
Just before his death, David Ruffin revealed the musicians he hated most. From his former bandmate, Otis Williams.
Okay, my question is to Otis. Why was David Ruffin fired from the Temptations?
Well, you see, when we first started out, we made a vow that we would not change.
To his replacement, Dennis Edwards.
You know who came to my house at 12 o'clock at night before they called me? David Ruffin. David Ruffin came to my house at midnight before they called me to Motown to ask me to be in the Temps. He says, they're going to ask you to replace me tomorrow.
To the white musicians who tried to help him, Hall and Oates. These are the feuds that consumed a Motown legend and ultimately killed him. So, let's get into it. The war that defined David Ruffin's entire career began with 5 words: David Ruffin and the Temptations. It was 1967, and after watching Diana Ross transform the Supremes into Diana Ross and the Supremes, Ruffin demanded equal treatment. But Otis Williams wasn't Diana Ross. He was a founder who saw Ruffin's demand as mutiny.
Okay, my question is to Otis. Why was David Ruffin fired from the Temptations?
Well, you see, when we first started out, we made a vow that we would not change.
The escalation was swift and brutal. Ruffin began traveling separately in a custom limousine with Tammy Terrell, while his bandmates took the tour bus. He'd miss rehearsals without explanation, and, most dangerously, started questioning the group's finances. Williams saw this as more than ego. It was an existential threat to everything they'd built. The breaking point came in June 1968 when Ruffin missed a crucial Cleveland engagement to attend a show with Barbara Martin, Dean Martin's daughter. While 4 Temptations performed without their lead singer, Williams made a decision that would haunt both men forever. That night, they drew up legal papers officially firing David Ruffin. Ruffin's response was pure venom. He told Williams that without him, the Temptations would fade into obscurity, that Dennis Edwards could never fill his shoes, that they'd come crawling back within a year. He was wrong about everything except the crawling back. They did ask him to return twice, in 1973 and 1982. But by then, addiction had made reconciliation impossible. Even at the 1989 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, when they supposedly buried the hatchet, the tension was visible. Ruffin's speech was gracious, but his eyes told a different story. 2 years later, dying in a crack house, his last coherent words were still about Otis Williams, how Williams would eventually destroy everyone in the group, just like he'd destroyed him. The man who sang about eternal love took his hatred for Otis Williams to his grave. Melvin Franklin was the Temptations' moral center, 6'2" with a bass voice that could shake buildings, and a nickname Blue that reflected his steady, reliable nature. He was also the one person David Ruffin couldn't charm, manipulate, or intimidate. Franklin's opposition went beyond professional disagreements. It was philosophical. Franklin believed in collective responsibility and group discipline. Everything Ruffin represented was antithetical to those values. Franklin later reflected on their early bond, saying,
"For the record industry, we were on the tour buses together, like 30, 40, 50, 60 days. And I can remember Stevie practicing this music on the back of the bus and driving everybody crazy all night long. Remember?"
Franklin believed in collective responsibility and group discipline. Everything Ruffin represented was antithetical to those values. As Ruffin's star rose with My Girl, he began treating the other Temptations like employees rather than partners. He'd change harmonies without warning and critique other members' performances in front of outsiders. The explosion came during a 1967 recording session. Ruffin arrived 3 hours late, high on cocaine, demanding they restart a song they'd already perfected. When Franklin objected, Ruffin dismissed him. "Man, Blue, just sing your little bass parts and let me handle the real singing." Franklin's response was swift. He walked out, followed by Paul Williams and Eddie Kendricks. After Ruffin's firing, Franklin became even more influential in group decisions. Ruffin saw this growing influence as personal betrayal. In his mind, Franklin had chosen Otis Williams over their friendship, prioritizing group politics over individual talent. The animosity became public during the 1982 reunion tour when Franklin confronted Ruffin about missing shows due to cocaine addiction. Ruffin called Franklin a company man and accused him of never having the courage to demand his own spotlight. Franklin's reply ended their friendship forever. Talent without character was just noise. Franklin died in 1995, 4 years after Ruffin. Their feud never found resolution. In Ruffin's final interviews, he still blamed Franklin for choosing group loyalty over individual brilliance. He never understood that Franklin's opposition came from love, not jealousy. Sometimes the people who care most are the ones who refuse to watch you destroy yourself. The most dangerous feud David Ruffin ever started was with Gordy Jr., the man who controlled everything at Mottown. By 1967, Ruffin was Motown's biggest male star, but when he asked to see financial records for songs he'd sung lead on, Gordy's response was telling: "Artists don't need to worry about business. That's what managers are for." Ruffin hired his own accountant and questioned why Motown artists received such small percentages compared to other labels. The financial warfare began subtly. Ruffin's solo projects got delayed, his songwriting credits were reduced, and studio time became unavailable. Gordy began feeding information to other Temptations about Ruffin's unreasonable demands, how he wanted more money than the rest of the group, how his ego was destroying their family atmosphere. But Gordy's most devastating weapon was enabling the culture where cocaine flourished. Late-night recording sessions, constant touring, pressure to produce hits, and access to unlimited money created the perfect breeding ground for addiction. When Ruffin's drug use began affecting performances, Gordy offered ultimatums, not help. The final confrontation came in early 1968 when Ruffin demanded his own label imprint and an audit of all Temptations' earnings. Gordy's response was strategic and brutal. He called an emergency meeting and painted David as greedy and destructive to group harmony in front of all 5 Temptations. Within months, Ruffin was fired. Not for drug use or missing shows, but for threatening the power structure that kept artists dependent. Even after leaving Motown, Ruffin couldn't escape Gordy's influence. Record deals fell through mysteriously. Radio stations stopped playing his new material. Ruffin died convinced that Gordy had orchestrated his downfall. He never understood that Gordy didn't hate him personally. He just couldn't allow any artist to threaten the system that had made them both rich. In Motown's world, the machine was more important than any individual talent. By late 1967, David Ruffin had achieved something no Temptation thought possible. He had united his bandmates against him. Paul Williams, Eddie Kendricks, Otis Williams, and Melvin Franklin, 4 men who often disagreed about everything, were now in complete consensus. David had to go. The group isolation began with cocaine-fueled betrayals. Ruffin would show up to rehearsals high, claiming he'd written new arrangements overnight. When others objected, he'd dismiss their concerns as jealousy. When they tried serious conversations about his drug use, he'd accuse them of sabotaging his success. The breaking point came during the "I Wish It Would Rain" recording session. Ruffin arrived 4 hours late, paranoid and agitated, insisting everything was wrong. When producer Norman Whitfield tried to calm him down, Ruffin exploded at his bandmates. The paranoia had consumed everything. Where Ruffin once saw friends and collaborators, he now saw conspirators. Every suggestion was an attack. Every concern was a plot. The final group intervention was devastating. All 4 members begged him to get help, offering to support him through treatment and hold his spot in the group. Ruffin's response was to laugh. He told them they needed him more than he needed them, that he could go solo and be bigger than the Temptations ever were. Within 6 months, he was fired unanimously. There was no debate, no hesitation, no regret. When Dennis Edwards joined as replacement, the other Temptations warned him about the crashed recording sessions, missed shows, and paranoid accusations. But they also told him about the David Ruffin they'd loved, the comedian, the perfectionist, the brother who'd helped create musical magic. In his final interviews, Ruffin still blamed the group for his downfall. He never understood that they hadn't turned against him. They'd been trying to save him from himself. His isolation was self-imposed, his paranoia drug-induced, and his hatred misplaced. The most psychologically devastating feud in David Ruffin's life was with Dennis Edwards, the man who replaced him. This wasn't about music. It was about legacy, identity, and the unbearable reality of being replaced by someone the world considered an upgrade. Edwards had been Ruffin's friend for years when the Temptations offered him the lead position. Ruffin publicly endorsed the choice while privately plotting psychological warfare.
You know who came to my house at 12 o'clock at night before they called me? David Ruffin. David Ruffin came to my house at midnight before they called me to Motcown to ask me to be in attendance. He says, they're going to ask you to replace me tomorrow.
During Edwards' first week, Ruffin started showing up unannounced at rehearsals, sitting in the back and shaking his head disapprovingly whenever Edwards attempted Ruffin's signature vocal runs. The real warfare happened on stage. Ruffin began appearing at Temptations concerts without warning, waiting until Edwards started singing My Girl, then walking on stage and taking the microphone. Audiences went wild, having no idea they were witnessing career sabotage. Edwards was trapped in an impossible situation. Fight for the microphone and look petty, or let Ruffin take over and look weak. Either way, his credibility was being systematically destroyed. The campaign escalated when Ruffin started calling radio stations before Edwards' interviews, suggesting that the real Temptations lead singer would be available later. Edwards finally snapped during a September 1968 Detroit concert after Ruffin's third unannounced stage invasion. Their backstage argument became physical before security separated them. Ruffin accused Edwards of being part of a conspiracy to erase his legacy, of trying to convince the world that Dennis Edwards had always been their lead singer. The paranoia was complete. In Ruffin's mind, Edwards wasn't just his replacement. He was the physical embodiment of his own failure. Every successful Edwards performance proved that Ruffin was expendable. Every standing ovation for the new guy was another nail in David's psychological coffin. The feud continued for decades. Even during the 1982 reunion tour, Ruffin would undermine Edwards' performances with subtle vocal sabotage. When Ruffin died in 1991, Edwards attended the funeral and sang My Girl, the song that had defined both their careers. The replacement war was never really about Dennis Edwards. It was about David Ruffin's inability to accept that he'd destroyed something beautiful and irreplaceable, himself. The most painful betrayal in David Ruffin's life came from Eddie Kendricks, his closest friend and creative partner. Their relationship represented everything beautiful about the Temptations' peak. Two distinctive voices creating harmonies that seemed divinely inspired. When that brotherhood shattered, it took part of Ruffin's soul with it. In early days, Kendricks and Ruffin were inseparable. They'd write harmonies together, practice vocal runs in hotel rooms, and push each other to reach higher notes and deeper emotions. But success changed their dynamic. As Ruffin's star rose with My Girl, he began seeing Kendricks as competition rather than collaboration. Every song Eddie sang lead on was one less showcase for David's voice. Every standing ovation for Kendricks felt like applause stolen from Ruffin. The first crack appeared during the Diana Ross and the Supremes controversy. When Ruffin demanded similar billing, Kendricks initially supported the idea, but when David began treating other Temptations like backup singers, Kendricks pulled his support, asking about fairness for the rest of the group. Ruffin's response was devastating. He accused Kendricks of jealousy, claiming Eddie couldn't handle David being the obvious star. Most painfully, he questioned whether Eddie had ever contributed anything truly important to their sound. The betrayal went deeper than professional disagreements. Kendricks had been covering for Ruffin's drug use, making excuses when David missed rehearsals. Their friendship exploded during Ruffin's final months with the group. Kendricks tried one last intervention, offering to pay for treatment and hold his spot. Ruffin accused Kendricks of trying to steal his position, of being weak and jealous and everything wrong with the group. After Ruffin's firing, Kendricks became increasingly detached. The magic they'd created together was gone. By 1971, Eddie was gone too, pursuing the solo career that Ruffin had abandoned the group to achieve. Their 1980s reunion was awkward, two old men trying to remember when they were young and magical. Kendricks died of lung cancer in 1992, admitting that losing David's friendship had been his career's greatest tragedy. Of all David Ruffin's feuds, his conflict with Paul Williams was the most heartbreaking because it was rooted in recognition. When Ruffin looked at Paul's decline into alcoholism and mysterious death, he saw his own future. That terrifying preview made him lash out at the one person who understood his pain. Paul Williams had been the Temptations' original lead singer until Ruffin arrived with My Girl. Unlike others who resented David's rise, Paul initially embraced it, recognizing superior vocal talent and stepping aside gracefully. His generosity should have created gratitude. Instead, it created guilt that Ruffin couldn't handle. As Ruffin's drug use intensified, Paul's drinking worsened. Both were self-medicating the same pain, realizing that talent alone wasn't enough to survive Motown's machine. Instead of finding solidarity, they became mirrors of each other's destruction. When Paul showed up drunk, David made cutting remarks about professionals who can't handle their business. The cruelest aspect was how similar their pain had become. Both dealt with health issues making performing difficult. Paul's sickle cell disease caused chronic pain, while David's drug use destroyed his vocal cords. Both felt undervalued by Gordy despite their contributions. The breaking point came during Paul's final months in 1971. His health failing and drinking out of control, he begged for time off to get treatment. David's response was characteristically heartless, claiming Paul wanted them to stop everything because he couldn't handle his problems. Paul Williams was found dead in his car on August 17, 1973, with a gunshot wound to the head. The official ruling was suicide, but circumstances were suspicious. When Ruffin heard about Paul's death, his reaction wasn't grief, it was paranoia. He became convinced Paul's death was a warning from Gordy. This conspiracy theory consumed Ruffin for the rest of his life. In his mind, Paul hadn't died from depression or violence. He'd been eliminated for knowing too much about Motown's practices. Ruffin would invoke Paul's name as evidence of Motown's corruption, not as a friend he'd lost, but as proof that the industry was literally killing its creators. The most surprising betrayal in David Ruffin's later career came from two white musicians who genuinely loved him, Daryl Hall and John Oates. Their 1985 collaboration should have been Ruffin's comeback moment. Instead, it became another reminder that even people who respected his talent couldn't save him from his demons. Hall and Oates had reached out to Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks for the Apollo Theater reopening. This wasn't charity. It was two hitmakers at their commercial peak choosing to share their spotlight with legends they genuinely admired. The resulting album was both critically and commercially successful. But success bred familiarity, revealing the extent of Ruffin's addiction. During follow-up collaborations, Ruffin would arrive hours late, or not at all. When he did show up, he was often high, paranoid, and impossible to work with. He'd demand changes to completed songs and accuse Hall and Oates of trying to control his artistic vision. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Ruffin began showing up to sessions with drug dealers, turning professional environments into scenes from his street life. He'd disappear for days, leaving expensive studio time unused and musicians unpaid. Hall, who had idolized Ruffin since childhood, was heartbroken to discover his hero was deeply damaged. The voice that had provided the soundtrack to Hall's youth was now coming from a man who couldn't be trusted to show up sober or treat people with basic respect. The final break came when Hall gently suggested David consider treatment for his addiction. Ruffin exploded, accusing them of racism, of trying to control him like plantation owners, of never understanding what it meant to be a black artist in a white industry. The accusations were particularly painful because they were partially true. The music industry had systematically exploited black artists for decades. But Hall and Oates had tried to use their privilege to help, to collaborate, rather than appropriate. The relationship ended with lawsuits and bitter public statements. The Hall and Oates collaboration represented Ruffin's last chance at mainstream success with major industry support. When that dissolved into acrimony, it closed the final door to the comeback he'd been chasing since 1968. Two white musicians who genuinely loved his artistry became the latest casualties in David Ruffin's war against everyone trying to help him survive. The deepest hatred in David Ruffin's life was never public, never acknowledged, but it consumed his final years. His jealousy of Marvin Gaye. While Ruffin had destroyed the woman he claimed to love, Gaye had created immortal beauty with her broken pieces. This wasn't about music, it was about two completely different ways of loving Tammy Terrell. Ruffin's relationship with Tammy began as a fairy tale in 1966, two of Motown's brightest stars finding love. But Ruffin's love was possessive and destructive. He'd surprise her with expensive gifts, then rage when she wasn't grateful enough. He'd propose marriage publicly, then reveal he was already married with 3 children. The relationship's toxicity reached a breaking point with allegations of physical abuse. In one particularly horrifying incident, Ruffin is said to have hit Tammy on the head with a motorcycle helmet during an argument. This violent episode was reportedly the final straw for Tammy, who decided to end their relationship in 1967. Her friends and family were deeply concerned about how Ruffin's behavior had impacted Tammy. Stories of his erratic actions painted a grim picture. One particularly shocking account involved a puppy Ruffin had given Tammy as a gift. According to some reports, Ruffin later beat the it in a fit of rage. While this claim remains unconfirmed, it underscores the level of instability that surrounded their relationship. Beyond the personal pain, Tammy's family also felt that Motown had failed to protect her during this time. Despite being aware of Ruffin's issues, the label did little to intervene or provide support. Tammy's mother, Jenny Montgomery, reportedly harbored a deep resentment toward Motown for prioritizing its stars' public image over their well-being. The emotional toll of her relationship with Ruffin wasn't just private, it seeped into Tammy's professional life as well. Her headaches, which were already a serious issue, doubled in intensity due to the stress and constant conflict. Friends later reflected that Tammy's bright-spirited nature began to fade as her emotional state deteriorated. Then came Marvin Gaye. When Tammy was paired with Marvin for Ain't No Mountain High Enough in 1967, she was still healing from Ruffin's abuse. Gaye approached their collaboration with protective tenderness, recognizing wounded prey. He didn't try to possess her, He tried to heal her through music. The contrast was stark. Where David had given Tammy anxiety and violence, Marvin gave her Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing and You're All I Need to Get By. Where Ruffin had made her question her worth, Gaye made her feel worthy of musical immortality. For Ruffin, watching Tammy's artistic renaissance with Marvin was psychological torture. Every hit duet proved she was better without him. Every magazine cover showing her smiling beside Gaye was public humiliation. Every interview where she glowed about working with Marvin was evidence that David had been the problem. When Tammy collapsed in Marvin's arms during their 1967 performance, it was symbolically perfect. The woman Ruffin had broken was literally falling into the arms of the man trying to heal her. Tammy died in 1970 at age 24. Gaye's tribute was What's Going On, an album that redefined soul music. Ruffin's tribute was years of self-destructive behavior. In his final interviews, Ruffin still couldn't acknowledge the truth, that his love for Tammy had been possessive and destructive, while Gaye's had been protective and creative. He died convinced that Marvin Gaye had stolen Tammy's heart with studio magic, never understanding that Gaye had simply offered her what Ruffin had taken away: safety, respect, and the chance to create something beautiful from pain. June 1st, 1991. David Ruffin died as he had lived since 1968, convinced that everyone else was responsible for his destruction. The hatred that had sustained him through 23 years of exile had finally consumed everything: his health, his relationships, his ability to create music, and ultimately, his life. The cruel irony is that most of his feuds were with people who had tried to help him. Otis Williams had given him multiple chances to return. Melvin Franklin had offered to pay for rehabilitation. Kendricks had covered for his addiction for years. Hall and Oates had tried to revitalize his career. Even Dennis Edwards had attempted peace. David Ruffin's greatest enemy wasn't any of the 9 people he'd feuded with for decades. His greatest enemy was the man in the mirror, a supremely gifted artist who couldn't forgive the world for not being as perfect as his voice. His hatred started as defense against real injustices, but metastasized into something that consumed everything good in his life. The musicians David Ruffin hated most were the ones who had tried to save him from himself. His feuds weren't about business disputes or creative differences. They were about a brilliant, broken man's refusal to accept help, love, or forgiveness. He took his hatred to his grave, along with the greatest voice Motown ever produced. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.